It's a widely held belief among Christians that Jesus' crucifixion was God's way of punishing him for our sins. But does this align with how sacrifice was done in the Bible? Let's unravel the ancient context of sacrifice, challenging common misconceptions, and shedding new light on how we interpret Jesus' ultimate sacrifice on the cross.
Everyone, this is Witch Pastor and tell you today I'm on with Dr. Max Botner. We're going to be talking about penal substitution. We're going to be talking about sacrifices in the Old Testament. We're going to talk about what they thought about sacrifice, what the purpose was. How are we doing today, Dr. Botner?
I'm doing well. It's Saturday, so I feel feeling relaxed.
Awesome.
You might get more out of me on a Saturday. I don't know.
There you go. All right. So for those not aware of you, can you tell people about your scholarly work, your YouTube channel, all that?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, I'm a New Testament professor. I've really been interested a lot in my research and writing on Jewish messianism and early Christology. So my first book was all about kind of Davidic messianism, and that intersects a lot with how Christians were reading the Jewish scriptures as well, which is another interest of mine. So those two kind of go together. I think it was Richard Bauckham who said, he's one of many who said basically all early Christology is Jewish exegesis, meaning anytime you want to say something about Jesus, the Jewish scriptures really are the vehicle through which you would do that. So that's always been fascinating for me. That didn't start in my PhD. That began when I was in seminary. I was just so fascinated by that. And that's continued. It's something I continue to work on. Done a lot on the Gospel of Mark. And I'm also very interested in, sacrifice and atonement, which is what we're talking about today. Hosted a conference a few years ago back in St. Andrews. Just a great time to meet a bunch of scholars. Ended up publishing a book called Atonement, Jewish and Christian Antiquity. Or something like that. Jewish and Christian Origins. I can't even remember. This is the problem. Sometimes the publisher retitles the book, and then
right.
the title that you came up with fits in your head, and the publisher's title is slightly different. But yeah, it's out there. Very academic work, but it was a great opportunity to get together a group of scholars in a broad, like Old Testament, early Judaism, New Testament, and get a variety of different perspectives on where they might go with this category of atonement and sin and sacrifice and all this kind of stuff. So that's fun. My thinking is continuing to evolve or crystallize. So I'm thinking more about sacrificial imagery in Paul's letters. There hasn't been a lot written on that, actually. I think earlier generations of scholars, especially the great Pauline scholars, really never focused at all on sacrifice. So it's a very interesting kind of recent turn that more New Testament scholars are thinking about what was, I think, one of the most important categories for ancient Jews, which is the whole cult, the sacrificial system, and everything. And and you mentioned my YouTube channel. So another facet is I really just love to engage with people and to try to take what I'm learning and what I'm learning from other people in biblical studies and bring it together in a format that other people can just benefit from and engage with. So we've got it's the Center for Bible Study YouTube channel, and part of it's coming out of my my podcast On the Way. So we do that, and then I've also been posting some of the classes we do because we have open public classes for people that they can attend, and they can even attend for free. They're all donation based, pay what you can. It's kind of like seminary light is how I think about it, right? So it's like bringing seminary to the people.
Cool.
And in fact, the next class I'm teaching in October, this may be of interest to some of your audience, is on atonement. So it'll be a 4-week class. So if anything is said today that you're like, hey, I'd like to dive deeper into that, love to have you register for the class, and you can join us virtually from your home. And so yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Cool, awesome. And how do they register?
Yeah, there'll be the link. So the registration a couple ways. I'm posting the link in various places, but if you go to our website, it's Jessup, jessup.edu/CBS. That will take you to our website, and on the front of the website coming up shortly should have the registration for that class.
Awesome. Okay. And so just digging right into the topic, what is the significance of the atonement? Why should we care?
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about atonement, the first thing we have to clarify is that's a really broad category. The English word it's actually like, I think it's the only theological term that we get from English. right? It was constructed at one meant. So the idea of reconciling God and humanity together, that's kind of the theory behind the word. So when we talk about atonement from the Christian theological tradition, we're basically talking about these sort of like meta theories about how God reconciles humanity to God's self, right, in Christ. So obviously there's a ton of discourse about this in Christian theology. There's models of atonement. You mentioned penal substitution. That's one. Christus Victor, moral exemplar. Um, yeah. Satisfaction model, which penal substitution is kind of a variant of that. So these different ways, like when Christian theologians ask the question, like, what did Jesus's death and resurrection accomplish? That's kind of the broad arena in which atonement gets discussed. The other side to this, though, is that that word atonement, or the verb to atone, gets used to translate certain terms in Hebrew and in Greek, although it's less used in Greek in the New Testament. So the verb kiper, which is it involves the idea of like cleaning or wiping away a stain. It's a way of thinking of sin, or in some cases not sin, but impurity, ritual impurity, cleansing that away. And that verb then shows up a lot in like Leviticus. And so it adds this kind of layer of complexity, because sometimes people are expecting atonement discourse in the Bible to be talking about atonement as they know it in church, or as if they heard about it from Christian theology. So unraveling all of that, thinking about how it all kind of goes together, is really interesting. But I think from a Christian perspective, there's a lot to be learned from thinking backwards a little bit. So thinking from a Jewish perspective of sacrifice, that that I would say doesn't lend itself to like the total picture of what we mean by the atonement as Christians, but it does, I think, enhance that picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I know for a lot of people it's significant because there's some moral implications, as in like, oh, God is killing his son or whatever, sacrificing his son, that seems morally gross. And then there's no, inspiration. So like, even if that's true, like, is that something that we have to see? Is that what the Bible's teaching? You can dive into that. A lot of different theories or views on that. But yeah, just can you give us a description of what atonement is?
Yeah, for sure. And just before that too, I think it's worth pointing out. So when we use the term sacrifice today, also, we are importing different things into that word
Okay.
that may not be part of like ritual sacrifice, right? So when you say God sacrificed, the Father sacrificed the Son, or the Son sacrificed himself, that language actually isn't, that's sacrifice in terms of like giving oneself up to death, right? Which is a kind of sacrifice, but it's not what ancient Jews saw going on in the cult, right? Like of sacrifice. And yeah, I mean, the only like sacrifice that I think you compare, and you see this compared, a human sacrifice in the Old Testament, is what's known as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. And you do get resonance of that in the New Testament, not sparing his only son, right? But the implications of that is really, I think it's two things. One, it's comparing like the way that Abraham was fully devoted to God to even more so, like a greater comparison to the way God is fully devoted to delivering humanity. And secondly, it's interesting to think about what exactly was the sacrifice in the Akedah. I lean towards the view that what is being seen as sacrifice is devotion and faith to God, not killing, right? So I think it's a theological way of thinking about what's entailed in the sacrifice. The sacrifice is about approach, devotion to God, and I think that in these texts where we see like human death or near human death, what's being valorized isn't the death itself, but the devotion of the person to God. So I think that sheds a little bit of different angle, and we can get more into like what animal sacrifice is and everything. But I think it's important to just highlight from the outset that the word sacrifice even carries a lot of baggage for us, and we're importing things into that that might not necessarily be there in the text, right? So you asked about atonement. What is atonement? Um, yeah, so it basically it's the idea of, again, it's this verb, this pl Hebrew verb kiper, which it's kind of the involves, I guess, the motion of cleaning or wiping something away, right? And so why would you need to do that? Well, there's different theories about this, but the dominant view um, goes to a Jewish scholar by the name of Jacob Milgram, which is that the sins of the people basically attach themselves to the sanctuary over the course of the year, and they has a sort of defiling effect, right?
Hmm.
Which is kind of, he doesn't go this way with it, but it's kind of beautiful if you think about it. God, the infinite, immortal God, wants to dwell with human beings, and God sets up his palace right in the midst of human beings because that's God's desire, to dwell with human beings. And over the course of that time, right, the implications of our humanity sort of attach themselves to the sanctuary. So it's the impurities of the people, which are not necessarily a moral issue, but they are connected to our mortality, and then the sins of the people. And so sin has to be atoned for, impurities have to be atoned for. They cleanse the sanctuary, and I also think, and this goes beyond Milgram, but his student Roy Gain, I think, argues convincingly that there is a cleansing effect also on the worshiper, um, as well. So I think, but I think the focus is on the sanctuary, and the idea again is it's a kind of a cleansing or a cleaning of the impurity or this what's attached to
Mm-hmm.
the sanctuary,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, interesting, interesting. Okay, so uh, I mean, obviously, there's a little debate there, right? So, would you say you did say that was the dominant position, uh,
Mhm.
but there is a little variation.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I think that like earlier scholarship, I think in particularly scholars that were coming out of like a Lutheran tradition, were basically shaped by the idea of a kind of penal substitutionary model, right, which you mentioned. And so some people had argued, and I think some people would argue, but I think you'd be really hard pressed to find a specialist now
Hmm.
that would hold this view. Some people had argued that what's happening is that the worshiper is transferring their sin or whatever, their guilt, onto the animal, and it's in the death of the animal that that some kind of like atonement's being made, like my life in exchange for this animal's life,
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. And so that was that had been for some people the primary focus of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
um and I think that's a reading of some of these texts, like in Leviticus, that is basically superimposing a certain view of penal substitution onto animal sacrifice, um in my view.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, there's that idea. There's different ideas about like, um, so a lot of people had used the metaphor of atonement as covering. In fact, if you're in a church service, you're probably likely to hear somebody say atonement is where God covers over
Yeah.
sin. And what's really fascinating about that is, so the Hebrew verb, that same root can mean cover in a different, like, yeah, it when it's not in the PL, like when it's in its standard call root, it can have the sense of cover over. And in fact, the cover on the mercy seat is called the caporet, so it's the same root word there, but it's actually, when you transfer it to the PL, it means the exact opposite. Rather than covering over, you're wiping it away,
Mm.
right? So
Yeah.
it's the opposite. Yeah.
Right. And just for the people that don't know Hebrew as much, it's basically just a different form of a verb. And in Hebrew, when there's different forms, they can change meanings. In this case, it's the opposite. Sometimes it can be just a very similar meaning or more intense. But yep. So, can you give the audience just a brief intro into the various sacrifices mentioned in the Old Testament?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there's a lot of them. The place probably to go, like, just kind of to get the broad overview, is the opening of Leviticus. So if you want, I'd encourage your audience to do this. Just read through the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. That's kind of setting out the what are the primary categories of sacrifice. And you find this like in later, like in early Jewish authors, people like Philo, when they're commenting on the sacrificial system, they basically use the same categories. Philo has 3 instead of 4 because he combines the sin and the guilt offering together. But this is the kind of the idea. So Leviticus opens up with the whole burnt offering, the olah, or and the idea of its whole, the entire animal is consumed in the fire on the altar, or most of it, and there's no part that's taken home and eaten or whatever. So that is introduced first. You get the ritual for the olah, and it's at the outset of Leviticus. So some have even proposed that maybe this is kind of foregrounding this particular sacrifice as being prominent. After the olah, you get the mincha, which is translated grain offering, or sometimes a cereal offering, right? It's a kind of flour that's brought to the sacrifice mixed with some oil, and that's Leviticus 2. And then the other 2 that Leviticus mentions is the chatat, which is translated sin offering. Often Milgram, who we've mentioned already, argued for purification offering, and basically his argument is that that form of the verb, like to that the verbal form of that involves kind of a wiping away again, or a de-sinning or something like that, if you like. And so he goes for purification. I think part of it too, right, is that if you look at Leviticus, the chatat is required not only for sin, but also for impurity. And impurity is not a moral category. It's just a category of life, right? So you're not a sinner if you're a woman who's menstruating, right? You're not a sinner if you're a man who has a nocturnal emission. You're not a sinner if you're a woman who gives birth. You're not a sinner if you're a person that buries their parents. In fact, if you didn't bury your parents and treat them well, you would be more of a sinner. So all of these things basically place you in the realm of impurity, which is a temporal period that you would be in. And the only way you would sin is if you brought impurity in proximity with God's sanctuary, right? But the idea is that there are rights for both the sin, both for sin, and Leviticus does say it's unintentional sin. So there's a kind of what's called a heavy-handed sin, which there is no there's no sacrifice for. It's you're cut off from the people. The only time where you have sacrifice that deals with all the sin, including the most heinous sin in the community, is on the Day of Atonement, where it says all of the iniquities and the crimes of the people are dealt with. We can get into that if you want. That's Leviticus 16. But so you've got the sin offering or the purification offering, depending on how you want to translate it. I don't mind sin offering. In the Greek translation of Leviticus, the translator does opt for, he uses, basically says the one peri hamartia, so the one concerning sin. That's how or concerning error. Hamartia is the word for sin or error. So that's that one. And then the last one is the asham, which is a guilt offering. And the idea with that is same ritual as the sin offering. The thing that has to be added on top of that is there needs to be restitution. So like financial reparations paid to the party that's been wronged. And so actually often it's translated into English as the reparation offering, because you're not only presenting the sin offering, but you have a financial kind of reparation being made to the person that's been wronged. So those are the 4 main categories of sacrifice that Leviticus introduces. And we see those show up in other places in the Hebrew Bible as well.
Okay, so you there was one that it appears you didn't mention. Maybe I missed it. The communion offering or peace offering is.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's Leviticus 3. I skipped right over that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the shalomim, which is the the kind of well-being offering, right? So it's the idea of you're basically like communing or having a meal with God, right?
Okay.
And that's kind of what happened. I mean, when you think about the what we do ritually in the Lord's Supper, when you're invited to the Lord's table, there's kind of that same idea of the Shalomim offering. Because the sin offering has already been made on our behalf, we have this ongoing communion or meal
Hmm.
with Jesus. Um, yeah, right, exactly. And this is the one sacrifice that's not direct, that you don't find atonement connected to. That's another interesting part, right? So which makes sense. There's not an atoning thing happening in the Shalomim. It's just this communion,
Hmm.
this peace or well-being
Hmm.
offering. And the worship, the idea is, right, the worshiper is getting a part of the sacrifice that they're taking home with them and eating, or either eating in, and that's what happens in Passover, right? Is you go, the Passover lamb is sacrificed in the temple, and then you go and you bring it home,
Hmm.
and you celebrate with family and friends, and you eat of the lamb there in your home.
Hmm.
Or at least Passover as it comes to be celebrated, right? The first Passover is a bit different, but once you have a temple and everything, right,
Yeah.
that's how Passover is.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, obviously, you mentioned a lot of different sacrifices there. How would you say, or what do you say are the biggest views in regards to how atonement gets figured out throughout all these different sacrifices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, what is a sacrifice? The primary term that Leviticus uses, I think, captures well what a sacrifice is and what most ancients, not just Jews, but ancient Mediterranean peoples would think of when they thought about sacrifice.
Hmm.
And the term that's used in Leviticus is korban, right? Gift, translated doron, or plural dora in the Greek. And you can think about like that debate that Jesus has with the Pharisees, or a group of Pharisees in Mark 7, about korban. You're dedicating some of the finances that you should be using to take care of your parents. You're designating that as gift, korban, for the temple, and you're kind of using that as a workaround to not honor your parents, like love your parents, take care of your parents, right?
Hmm.
Um, so that's the idea of sacrifice as a gift, and it makes possible approach to God, right, to the deity, right? So you're giving a gift to God, you're communing with God. It allows for approach, for fellowship, and the ongoing maintenance. When we're talking about Jewish sacrifice, I think that's the key thing to emphasize. Is Leviticus is really about the maintenance of the covenant relationship that God has set up, right? So if God, the holy God, is going to dwell amongst uh, mortal, sinful human beings, how is that relationship going to be maintained?
Hmm.
And the sacrificial system is what does that, in Leviticus. And so, yeah, what's happening in atonement is that's the ongoing maintenance, or the cleansing of the sanctuary that happens throughout the year. And then, in particular, once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, or the Day of Purification, where you have these two rites, with the two goats that go different directions. And that is what kind of, if you like, resets the temple in as a whole for the next year, right? So you're atoning for, you're cleansing the temple, and you're cleansing the people. And in the what we call the scapegoat, or the goat for Azazel, this
Hmm.
wilderness demon, you're sending, you're basically taking all of the sin of the people, putting it on this animal, and sending it away from God, as far as away as you can get out in the wilderness.
Hmm.
um so, and then that should tell us something too, that when you do transfer sin onto an animal, you don't take it to God, you send it away from God.
Hmm.
Because sin and death don't go towards the presence of Yahweh, they go the opposite direction,
Hmm.
is the idea.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So let's see here. I'm gonna edit this out, but I think I messed up the questions. I asked you what atonement was before, and then I actually asked you for multiple views, and then I basically just asked the same question again. Was there anything else you wanted to say about other views on that?
No, I mean, if you want to talk about, we could talk about the theories about the transferring of sin. That might be interesting to
Okay.
people, because that's something that there's a lot of different ideas about that. But
Okay. Yeah,
I
sure.
think most Christians today in church still think that sin is like transmitted from the person to the
Mm.
animal, and I don't think so.
Okay. So Um, all right, yeah. So, could you talk about just various ways people think about how the sin is transferred, or I guess sin is removed?
hmm Yeah. So there's a big, I think, a big disconnect between older views, particularly in Christian circles, of what's happening in an animal sacrifice, and what scholars, Jewish Hebrew Bible scholars, think is happening in Leviticus, and I'm quite convinced that they're correct. So um, the idea that a lot of people have is that sin is being transferred directly to the animal, so that the worshiper comes, right? You come, you bring your animal to the temple, to the priest outside the court. You place your hands on the
Hmm.
animal, and by placing your hands on the head of the animal, you are transferring your sin onto the animal, and then the animal is killed in your place. So it's kind of almost like a visual representation, right? It fits very well with some views of penal substitution. You sinned, you deserve to die. Now watch this animal die in your place. Got it, right? Um, Kind of a horrific picture as well, but I think that's basically the idea for people. Now, what's going on in the hand leading is that's very, very, very unlikely.
Hmm. Okay.
So several things. One, when we think about like penal substitution, we think about the abuse of the victim, because we know Jesus was abused on his way to being crucified. Um, you don't abuse an animal that you're going to sacrifice. In fact, you couldn't sacrifice it if it were abused. The animal has to be without blemish. It has to be the best of your flock. So it's like you're giving your best to God,
Hmm.
is kind of the idea, right? And you would have taken care of it and tended to it, um, and the way you would kill it would be killed would be in the cleanest, quickest way possible, right? Not some like brutalization
Yeah.
of the animal. So that's one thing. Secondly, the laying on of hands, right? So um, there's very unlikely that there's any sort of transferring of sin happening there. There was a debate for a while as to whether, well, it's still an ongoing debate in um, Leviticus 16. That's the one place where the son of Aaron lays both hands on the head of the animal, and it says that sin is transferred. So that's like the one text that you could go to in Leviticus or anywhere in the Jewish scriptures to say sin is transferred onto the animal. But then, like medieval Jewish scholars recognize, like, hey, in our Masoretic text, that's the Hebrew text, all the other sacrifices, the way that they're pointed, the vowels are put beneath the characters to, in many cases, it's interpretation. Um, that is, it's only one hand. So if you read in your English translation, which follows the Masoretic text, the other times when they put the hand on, it's one hand. You're leaning one hand on the head of the animal, and so the argument from someone like Ibn Ezra was that that's what sets apart the transferring of sin in Leviticus 16 from all the other sacrifices, where you're just laying one hand on the animal. And so a lot of people have argued, okay, the one hand signals not transferring of sin, but kind of an identification, like before the priest, before the Lord, this is my gift to the Lord.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a way of designating. Now, what's interesting is the Hebrew characters can actually be read without the vowel pointings that's put on. You can actually read the Hebrew characters as a dual. In other words, the other places that they're pointed singular could actually be implied two hands,
Hmm.
right? And if you look at the Greek translation, it's not consistent with one hand or two hands. So other than these sacrifices designate two hands, which suggests that at least for that Greek translator, he was reading the Hebrew as a dual in some of these cases, as both hands. But still, what do the two hands signify? Now, this is really interesting. The earliest comment that I'm aware of that we have on the two hands is from Philo of Alexandria, so a contemporary of Jesus. That doesn't mean Philo is right in light of what Leviticus originally intended.
Mm.
But it's a great example just to say we need to pump the brakes on what we think's happening in this. He says the reason that we set two hands on the animal is to show that we are innocent. Okay, not transferring of sin, not transferring sin onto the animal. It's a sign of our innocence before God as we send our gift to the Lord. So it's just to pump the brakes and say nothing in the text is really telling us, right, what's happening in this hand leaning. But if we put all the evidence together, the idea that sin is being transferred onto the animal
Mm-hmm.
is very unlikely. In particular, because the one place that we have sin transferred to the animal, Leviticus 16, it's sent exactly the opposite direction from the presence of Yahweh, because it's unthinkable that you would bring sin into the presence of God, right? That just doesn't that wouldn't happen. Um, yeah, so that's I think really important, to just to kind of point out and to highlight, and people can chew on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the best interpretation of what's happening when a worshiper puts their hand on the animal is that you're designating your gift before the Lord.
Okay.
There was one other kind of take on this, maybe a bit of a mediating position or a slightly different position from the Tübingen school. So people like Bernd Janowski and his predecessor Geza Harmut, or Harmut Geza, excuse me, um, which was that when you put your hand on the animal, you're basically identifying with the animal. And so what they meant by that is not that the animal is dying in your place, but rather that as the blood of the animal is brought into the sanctuary, the blood signifying the life, that it's like via the animal's blood, the worshipers being brought into the presence of God. So that was their view of it, which in some ways works really well with what we see going on in Hebrews, but that's a whole different thing.
Okay. So just so I can clarify here. So basically what you're saying is that there's some instances of the priest putting one hand on the animal that is dying or dead, and then there's one specific instance in Leviticus 16 where he puts both hands on, and you're saying that the text of Leviticus 16 explicitly mentions, hey, there's something going on with sin here, and then you're also including that animal that they're putting the two hands on is going outside of the temple.
Not just outside of the temple. It's basically going into the netherworld, right? Like, I mean, there's a reason why when Christians started reading this allegorically, they equated the scapegoat with Jesus's descent into hell, because you're going. I mean, that's Origin of Alexandria, right? You're going as far into the netherworld as you can with the sin, because it's an image, right? That sin is being taken as far away from the people and the presence of God as it possibly can be. So, like in the Mishnah, right? What does it say? This is the early rabbinic textual tradition. It takes that, like, when the animal had been brought into the farthest area, there was a scarlet rope that would be hanging in front of the temple, and the red scarlet would turn to white when the animal had been driven, as far as away. And it quotes Isaiah, though your sins be like scarlet, I will make them white as wool, right? So that was kind of like the visual imagery of the animal carrying the sin away from the people.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. But at the end of the day, there's some ambiguity, right? So there's nothing definite, right? Which is why you have all these
I would say
arguments.
that in all ritual literature, literature that describes rituals, there's going to be ambiguity, because the primary focus it's a kind of theology by way of describing ritual, right? Talking about how to do the ritual. But it's not what we're often after is kind of like what Philo does, or what some other like interpreters do, which is explain to us what's happening in the ritual, right? And it's totally legitimate, like what Milgram does and others do. But yeah, it's not set out for us in the ritual itself. The Leviticus is not that kind of literature. It's like describing rituals to us, but not telling us what every act in the ritual means. We have to kind of do some work to think about what where the emphasis is put. One more example
Good.
for you on
Cool.
this is when you're thinking about sacrifice, what's the natural act that we go to typically as Christians? We think about death, right? Well, in the sacrifice, death is really the act that is the least important. So if you look at the Masoretic text, the animal is killed, and then everything thereafter is what the priest really does, right? And so when what really receives the most focus in descriptions of Jewish sacrifice is not the death. The death is sort of ancillary. It's necessary because you need, if you're talking about animal sacrifice, it's not always necessary. I mean, if it's a grain or whatever, but if it's an animal, you need the death. But what's really what receives the most focus in early Jewish theologizing about sacrifice is blood manipulation. What's done with the blood, where it's applied, and then also burning. The burning, that's another major focus. So if you read through, again, I'd encourage your audience, read through the sacrifices in Leviticus 1-7. The most focus is put on the burning of choice parts of the animal and where the blood is applied. And that's actually what distinguishes certain levels of sin offering as well. Where is the blood brought? Well, into different parts of the sanctuary. Only once a year is it brought all the way into the Holy of Holies, where it's sprinkled 7 times. So yeah, what's done with blood becomes very important, which is why Hebrews says without the pouring out of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins, right? Or similar to what the rabbis say, early rabbinic tradition. What is it? Without blood, there is no atonement. So, yeah, it becomes more and more focused in their thinking. The act of blood manipulation becomes a primary place where people look to think about what's really happening in a sacrifice. But the idea here is we run to death, like it's all about killing. That's not how an ancient would think about sacrifice. Not just Jews, but Greeks and Romans. Like their killing is a part of it, but the ritual that goes on with blood and different things receives much more focus. In fact, I think the best book on, if people are interested, on sacrificing in Greek culture is by Fred Naden. It's called Smoke Signals to the Gods.
Okay.
And that should tell you something. It's not killing to the gods, it's smoke signals to the gods, right? Which is very similar in logic to the sweet smelling aroma that's mentioned in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thank you for adding that. So,
Yeah.
so clarification for me. So you mentioned that Leviticus 16 has the 2 hands, but there are other mentions in the other sacrifices of just one hand being laid on the animal. If something like the Septuagint or even the letters of Hebrew without the vowels, if they can possibly be mentioning 2 in the other mentions, why couldn't those have been about transferring sin?
Yeah, they potentially could be, right? So my point is that I don't think the distinction between transferring sin and not transferring sin comes down to whether you have 1 or 2 hands. I think it comes down to what you do with the sacrifice, what you understand to be doing with the sacrifice. And so I think that the idea is that in Leviticus 16, transferring sin onto an animal is the one-off, right? That's the one time where sins are actually transferred. I don't think that's the norm of what's normally happening when you're laying hands on an animal. And again, that would come down to thinking about the implications of putting sin onto an animal that you're going to then take into the presence of the temple. It's kind of an oxymoron, right?
Yeah. So I guess the idea is that the transfer of sin is only mentioned in Leviticus 16 or in that specific sacrifice, so that you think it would be mentioned in the other sacrifices if that's what was happening. Is that kind of the idea?
I mean, that's part of it. I think that just the other part of it is thinking through the theology of the priestly system as best as we can reconstruct it, and the high unlikelihood that theology would, based on everything we can see, would think it's a good idea to put sin on an animal
Yeah.
that you take into the temple.
Gotcha.
I think
Yeah.
that's the real clincher.
Okay.
And then I would just point, kind of as a secondary point, I'd point to someone like Philo,
Mm.
who's commenting on this. And again, he's probing kind of more like the spiritual depth of what's going on
Mm.
in sacrifice, right? But yeah, I mean, to him, it's like, yeah, he has the Septuagint, right? He is not reading it in Hebrew, so he's reading it in Greek. He said, yeah, we lay 2 hands on the animal. Why do we do that? To show we're innocent, right? So it's not like certainly it's not an obvious thing that this is a transferring thing. I think it only becomes, and I think that's why Leviticus 16 points it out, because it wants it's in this case, right? You need to know as the people, in this instance, our sin is being put on this animal, and for that very reason, it's being driven away from the community, away from the presence of God.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this is a bit of a curveball. I can edit this out if you're not prepared for this.
All right. You told me the curveball's coming though, so I should be ready to hit it now, right?
I would hope. No. So I just Googled this. All right. There's a scholar. I guess his name is Bavink or something like that.
Yeah, Herman Bavinck.
Okay. So he argued that the sin is being transferred because of the laying on hands, and he said this because when laying of hands is mentioned in the Bible, it implies some kind of transmission. So apparently, there's a transmission of blessing in Genesis 48 and Matthew 19. There's a transmission of a curse in Leviticus 24, a transmission of an office in Numbers 27, Deuteronomy 34 as well, and then transmission of the Holy Spirit in Acts 8, whenever there is, laying of hands. And then even similarly, in the case of bloody sacrifices as well as burnt and thank offerings in Leviticus 1 and 3 for sin that has been acknowledged and confessed. I know it's a lot, might be too much to handle on the spot, but what do you think? Like, doesn't that imply that something's being transferred? And if you think there is actually something being transferred, what is it?
Yeah, good. Okay, so I think this also illustrates, if it's Bavinck, and I'm thinking about this, this also maybe illustrates a difference between the way that biblical scholars and theologians operate, right? Because he's a systematic theologian, and so what he's doing is he's taking the canon of the Bible and basically kind of trying to connect any instance where you see hand laying and some kind of transference in some broad sense. But I mean, a lot of these examples from the New Testament are obviously wouldn't be on the radar of Leviticus, right? If we're talking about what's happening in Leviticus, so or what the writer is intending to communicate. So I think we have to be careful there, because that all of those examples are kind of different types. They're not all ritual cultic acts. They're different instances. So yeah, I get it. The laying on of hands is a powerful signal. And I guess, again, to highlight with ritual, right? There's a possibility. Ritual is polyvalent. When you're doing things in ritual, they can communicate different things to different people. So certainly it's possible that somebody might connect laying on of hands with other places where hands are laid on, and that there's some kind of transference taking place. It may be that there is some kind of, in some real way, identification, like, this is my gift, right? And with this gift, there I go into the presence of God, or something like that. I just don't think that there's any real solid evidence for, here I'm transferring my guilt, my sin onto this animal. That's the part that I think we have to push back against. Some kind of identification, some kind of I don't know. I'm just not persuaded that there has to be some kind of like real ontological transfer going on, or maybe there is some kind that's being understood, but I don't think it is. I don't think it is that my sin is being transferred onto this animal. That's the part that I think is really difficult. And the idea that, well, we have other texts where hand laying signifies some kind of transference. I mean, when I bless somebody and I put my hands on them, am I transferring my blessedness to them? Well, not really. I'm signifying kind of like the, I don't know, like the um, yeah, I'm enacting God's blessing upon them tangibly. They can feel that, as I lay my hands on them. Um, but it's not like transferring something directly from me to them,
Hmm.
right? Um, Likewise, if I go pray, James, lay hands on the sick when you pray or
Mhm.
whatever. Okay, well, we have hand laying on the sick. It's not as if by laying my hand on a sick person, I'm transferring my health to their sickness or something. You know what I mean? Like, so the idea that we have other places in the Bible where there's some kind of like laying hands on has these kind of different
Yeah.
effects. That doesn't mean that therefore that's a good argument that in laying hands on an animal, now we have some kind of direct transfer of
Mhm.
my sin properties onto the animal. I just don't see
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. So one, it's vague. Two, it's possible, but there's a list of reasons to think not. And
Yeah.
three, it's like, why would you choose that choice among all of the others if you don't have a
Yeah.
legitimate reason to do so? So yeah, that's really interesting. Appreciate that. So let's see here. Um, yeah, okay, here's another one. One of my scholar friends said the below quote, what are your thoughts? Okay, the laying on of hands is not a transferal of sin per se, but it is a complete identification of the person with the animal they are sacrificing. The animal is a substitute for the offer, and since the offer is a sinner, that identification is made as well. Do you agree with that sentiment, or how do you understand that?
I yeah, that's it's tricky, right? Like, so is that a meta theory of all sacrifice? One particular, I suppose they're probably thinking about the sin
Mm-hmm.
offering in particular,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which again, is worth highlighting. That's only one sacrifice. So when we think about sacrifice as Christians, we often run to sin sacrifice because we know Jesus took our sins away, and so that must be what the whole system is about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think I think this person's still trying to maintain a model of sacrifice that lends itself to substitution, and I just don't fully see it. Now I'd imagine they'd go to Leviticus 17:11, right? And that's probably would be the best. Leviticus 17:11 is an important text, right? Um, what is it? It's talking about I've given you, that is the blood, to make atonement for yourselves upon the altar.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's an important text, and there is a kind of I think there is a substitutionary motif there. The question is how far to press it. Um, yeah, and in what ways,
Hmm.
right? So Milgram and others do see that in kippur, in this verb of making atonement, there's also the same root of ransom, kofar, and so they do see a ransoming happening here in this
Mm-hmm.
instance of um, yeah, like a, a substitutionary ransoming of the worshiper in the giving the application of the blood of the animal to the altar. Um, and so, yeah, what I would say is that, like, in the sin sacrifice, if we're talking about that in particular, I think I basically follow Roy Gain, which is that there is there is an identification of with the worshiper, with I'm designating this is my gift, I'm identifying it. um the my my sacrifice cleanses the temple of the sin that had been attracted to it, and it also provides a cleansing benefit for me um in going on. So there is and that needs to happen, like, because if you don't do that, right, that is when the wrath, I guess, would break out, right? So there does need to be some kind of handling of that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not 100% sold. Like, I'm not sold on quite the way that your friend described it.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think there's a total identification of the person
Yeah.
with the animal. I guess that's where I would
Right.
where
Right.
I
Right.
would stop short.
Yeah. There is. I guess when you get these vague texts, they don't explicitly lay it out. Like there's options, and once again, it's just one of those things where it's like, what reason is there to take that entire identification idea and take that view?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, a good book
mhm,
for people that are really interested in this. I mean, there are parts of it that I'm not sure about, but Jay Sklar, Sklar, he has a book on atonement. It's not cheap, but it's a very comprehensive treatment
okay.
of all the texts in the Bible, uh, and what he's looking at is precisely this connection between the need to have a ransom that takes place to avoid the wrath and the purification, and trying to see if there's a way to kind of synthesize what some have kind of kept separate.
Hmm.
And so that would be probably a really good place to go for people if they want to get like, what's great about it is he takes you through all the text, so that way you might disagree with them, but at least you're getting walked through all of the text in depth, and and you can kind of see his argument, which is that in atonement there is a ransom being taken place in all
Hmm.
instances. I Yeah, so leave it at that.
Very cool. Awesome. Okay. Um, Question. You mentioned the idea of wrath. Is there any idea of wrath in any of these sacrifices?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think where you see um, wrath come into play is when, uh, yeah, not in the sacrifices themselves,
Hmm.
but that there's were were they not to be done? Were like if the system, like if people don't follow the
Hmm.
system, right? So if I ignore God's prescriptions or
Yeah.
whatever for how this is supposed to work. Like think about Leviticus, when the sons of Aaron, this is Leviticus 10, Nadab and Abihu, when they bring strange fire into the presence of
Hmm.
God, whatever that is. I have a friend that has a very interesting take on that. When they bring this strange fire into the presence of God, they're incinerated, like this kind of horrific scene.
Hmm.
Well, that's the wrath breaking out, right?
Yeah, sure.
so so yeah, I mean, if you don't make atonement or restitution, then wrath could break out. If you don't take impurity seriously and you just bring it into the temple, right, that's more where it'd be associated. But um the idea of like we're under God's wrath and we make this sacrifice to get God to not be wrathful towards us, I think that's probably more of a Christian, like, penal substitutionary kind of idea that we're reading into the text a little bit. I don't think that that's like the logic of it, but I do. Wrath is certainly an element
Hmm.
to, what's it, like the anger of God can break out in these texts, and like if you uh, if we have like, we haven't really gotten into this, but like the sin, like moral issues, big moral issues like murder and things like
Hmm.
this, um, they defile the land, right? And if they're not taken care of, the wrath can break out, right? And Numbers 35 would be a good example of this, like bloodshed in the land, um, defiles the land, and God says in Leviticus, right? Like if you defile my land and you don't you ignore my
Hmm.
statutes, like I'm going to vomit you out of the land, and that's what happens in the exile.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. So, just to make things clear, you don't know of any texts that talk about sacrifices and God going from taking his wrath on the people to the sacrifice.
No, and that's an important thing to emphasize. So yes, we sometimes think that, like, again, because Jesus took our punishment, we have that model that the animals are being punished by God in being sacrificed. That idea is not there
Hmm.
whatsoever. The only place where you have um, a victim enduring punishment, abuse, is I mean, it's a classic text that's all over the New Testament, the suffering servant in Isaiah,
Hmm.
right? And I would say that the suffering servant, so this is Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, that the suffering servant is not he is certainly a representative, right, of the community. So he endures the opprobrium and the mistreatment that the community uh, is suffering kind of as a result of being in
Hmm.
exile. But the suffering servant is not a sacrifice per se, right? There's not ritual. Some people try to find it there because the Hebrew has the term asham, and then the Greek takes that term and translates it peri hamartia, sin offering. But if you read the Greek, it says if you plural present your sin offering. So it's like the idea what's going on in that is that the community is recognizing retrospectively that this servant has borne the curses of exile in his body, right? Whether this is whoever this servant is. Okay, we'll just say now it's from a Christian perspective, it's Jesus, right?
Hmm.
But that this servant has borne the curses of exile, and and the community didn't recognize it. We didn't esteem him. We didn't
Hmm.
we thought he was rejected by God, and then retrospectively, as the poem begins, behold, my servant is high is exalted. Our eyes are open. Now we turn in repentance, and we basically we benefit from what the servant has done on our behalf. So there's definitely a substitutionary model, but it's not in terms of like it's endurance of the curses of
Hmm.
exile. Um, it's not the servant being like abused by God per se,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Interesting.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really interesting discussion in your book. You talked about, or not you specifically, but one of the writers talked about the all the mentions in the New Testament, and they all mention the almost all of them mention the Greek, but like there's a weird thing going on where it's like only the Hebrew can really give you that argument
Mhm.
that some type of penal.
Yeah, I believe that was Christian Eberhard. Chris has done a lot on this. By the way, I should have mentioned, I still think his if this is probably actually the best introduction available because it's really short, very clear. This is my number one recommendation to your viewers. Get Chris's book, Christian Eberhard, Understanding Atonement Biblically. He'll walk you through all the Old Testament sacrifices and then also discuss some New Testament stuff. Super,
Hmm,
super helpful.
cool.
And it's short. It's only like 120 pages or something like that. So it's uh, very accessible.
Hmm.
Really, really helpful. Yeah, what he was talking about there. This is something that other scholars have noted as well. German scholar Wolfgang Kraus wrote a really good article on this. It's in German, so but basically looking at the differences between the Greek translation of that poem and the Hebrew.
Hmm.
And I think what it just highlights for us is that there's a lot of ambiguity in that text, and and so the Greek is an interpretation of what's going on
Hmm.
there.
Okay.
Is basically the idea, and I still think you can get some kind of he was handed over, especially the end, right? Handed over to death, like on our on account of our sins. I mean, there's definitely that causal kind of reality, but yeah, whether he's a direct substitute, I mean, we could debate that. I don't mind talking in substitutionary terms, but
Hmm.
I think the value of thinking in those terms is that if we're putting ourselves into the setting of the early Christian movement, um, that text and the way that text is being read is part of a larger stream of tradition of trying to make sense of, first off, what's going on in that text,
Hmm.
and then how does the events of Jesus clarify what we think is going
Hmm.
on in that text, right?
Hmm.
So I mean, the Ethiopian eunuch asks a great question: who's the prophet speaking about, himself or someone else, right? And so you kind of need to know, first off, who the servant is, and then once you have that in place, you can kind of start thinking about, based on your textual tradition, what's happening, what's the
Hmm.
servant doing on behalf of the people.
Interesting.
But the Greek text, I think, very interestingly takes it that it's that that God vindicates the servant, right? My righteous one, he will vindicate. And I think that's what's going on, for example, at the end of Romans. Romans, what is it, 4:25, where he is handed over on account of our sins, raised on account of our justification, right? And it's so the servant is vindicated, and it's through his vindication that others can be then
Hmm.
vindicated or righteous. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So, I mean, is there any mention of animals paying for the sin of the people in the Old Testament? I mean, obviously, you get some kind of like legal language in the New Testament, but do you see anything like that in the Old Testament?
No, not animals, not in that way. Not animals paying for the sins of the people.
Okay.
No.
Interesting. All right.
Hmm.
So, I mean, why the change? Is that just, how Paul talked or whatever? You like that metaphor? Or
Yeah.
why, how do you understand that New Testament mentions
No.
of
Yeah.
paying?
I don't think. Great. Yeah. I mean, I don't think Paul. I don't think Paul would say animals pay for the sins of people either. I mean, Paul was a Second Temple Jew. Paul went to the temple. You see in Acts, he was arrested,
Mm,
sacrificing at the temple. When he talks about Israel, Romans 9:5, is it? He's talking about the people of Israel, and including in that, theirs is the doxa, the glory. Like he's talking about the glory of God that dwells in the temple still. So, yeah, he's not. Um, I don't think Paul would put it in that way. Paul does use the ransom metaphor,
mm,
right, to talk about believers being bought out of kind of slavery,
mm,
right? And so yeah, there's payment language in that for sure. The other thing too that is good, maybe helpful to keep in mind, is that the primary way of thinking about sin in the Second Temple period is the metaphor sin as debt. The wages of sin are death, right? In fact, the Aramaic term for sin at the time was the word debt, right? So when Jesus, prays the Lord's, teaches his disciples the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts
mm,
as we've forgiven our debtors, right? So thinking about and talking about treasures in heaven and all of this kind of stuff, right? Payment, like all that language comes in. It's not sacrificial language, though. It's not cultic language per se, but it is, it's a primary way that they're thinking about debts,
mm,
right? And a great image, right? In Colossians, he took our debt receipt and nailed it to the cross.
mm,
That term there in Greek, is referring to the bill of debt that the people owe, and that they're enslaved to that debt,
mm,
and that was nailed to the cross with Jesus. So there absolutely is a release of debt, sin debt, that happens in the crucifixion and resurrection, 100%. But it's not sacrificial.
okay.
That sacrificial is not the way to think about it, right?
Okay. Cool. All right. Last couple questions here. What role does offerings play in regards to forgiveness of sin?
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, so it's really interesting. If you read, again, encourage your readers, read Leviticus 1 through 7, read Leviticus 4 straight through. And what you'll notice is that when the sacrifice, the sin offering, the chatat is being made, there's two things that happen. There's the kipparing, the atonement, and then it says it's passive, nislah. Yeah, it will be forgiven to them. And I think what's happening there is it's identifying that the priest through the ritual is making the atonement, but the forgiveness is to God alone, right? It's Yahweh who forgives it to them, who forgives sin. And so it's not like this magical rite that you just do it no matter where you're at. Like, you have to actually be in it, right? As the prophets tell us, um, you don't just celebrate the Day of Atonement and defraud your neighbor, right? Like, God's not happy about that. He's not pleased. He's not surprised. So too today, if you're like writing a check to God, but the money you're getting is, because you're abusing your laborers or whatever,
Mm,
like that, God's not sitting back and, oh, I'm so impressed, thank you for that, right? So the idea of forgiveness is it's the Lord's alone,
Hmm.
right? It's God's alone. And you think about like Mark 2:7, like when the scribes who are present in the house, right? Who can forgive sins except the God who is one, or except the one God, right? It's a reference to the Shema,
Hmm.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. um and so yeah, it like raises the question, like, what's Jesus doing here? But that's a whole nother topic. And but that's the idea. Forgiveness is the Lord's. The
Hmm.
Lord forgives. It's not, it's tied to the right, but it's not
Yeah.
like a magical kind of waving of the wand,
Hmm.
right? We don't manipulate God. God forgives.
Hmm. Really, really cool. Okay. All right. Last thing here. So you talked in your videos, and you briefly mentioned it earlier about the idea of mortality in the sacrifice. Like the focus isn't death; it's mortality.
Mhm.
So could you draw that out? Like, why do you come to that conclusion, and why the difference there?
Yeah. So this is another facet of us as scholars trying to discern the logic of ritual impurity, right? Again, it's not spelled out in the text. You're not going to find a hidden verse somewhere in Leviticus that tells you kind of this is the secret to it all, and this is why we were doing X, Y, or Z. So Milgram was highly influential here in arguing that what's going on in all facets of ritual impurity are connected to death. And some people, brought up different issues with that, like, well, then why would birth is the opposite of death, unless someone's dying in birth, but just general birth is the opposite of death, and so why would that be, so where it got nuanced to, and where I think many land, myself included, is that all of these categories of ritual impurity are basically tied to human mortality, broadly understood, right? So even natural birth is tied to human mortality, which is why Jesus taught that at the resurrection, right, they're neither going to marry or be given in marriage, because they're going to be what, like the angels. Some What does that look like? I don't know, but the idea here is, what's the primary purpose of marriage, right? I mean, we might dispute this today, but from antiquity's perspective, what's the primary purpose of marriage? It's procreation, right? And so if you're not going to have ongoing procreation, because procreation is tied to mortality, right? Coming through woman is that's the necessary means of life. Eve is the mother of life, but that leads to a kind of life that ultimately will lead to death and mortality.
Hmm.
And so the idea is humanity is in this state of death, and at the resurrection there's a transference, or a what's a better word, like a we're remade into this kind of being, whatever substance that is, that can remain in the presence of God forever and ever.
Hmm.
And you see that throughout biblical and early Jewish and Christian traditions. When people, human mortal beings, are brought into the presence of God, their bodies are either hidden or concealed in some way, or God hides or conceals his glory, or the human body is like taken up in some kind of like fiery flame and made into some different kind of, there's some kind of change, like substantive change that has to happen,
Hmm.
so that human flesh can be in the presence of the divine.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm persuaded that that's although again the text doesn't tell us that, but that's kind of the meta theory as to what's going on behind the idea of
Hmm.
mortality.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Okay, so I'm less sure that may be how Leviticus understood it in its original context. I mean, I think that probably, but from like an early Jewish and Christian
Hmm.
perspective, which is more my area of expertise, the late Second Temple period, I think it's very likely that that's how many of like the New Testament authors thought about
Hmm.
it.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I just found it fascinating for you to say that because, Genesis, Adam and Eve and the whole mortality thing going on there, and
Mm-hmm.
even Adam
Mm-hmm.
maybe, or like being formed from the dirt is kind of
Mm-hmm.
like something going on there in regards to
Mm-hmm.
mortality with, that's what John Walton at least argues. But
Yep. Yep. Yep.
yeah, no, I,
Yep.
I appreciate you coming on here. That's all I got for you. This has been an absolute pleasure. Any last
Yeah.
thoughts? Anything you want to share before we let you go?
Man, no, thanks so much for having me on. It's really fun to talk about this. It's always a treat to find someone that wants to talk about this kind of stuff because it can feel esoteric
Hmm.
sometimes, but I would just encourage people, like, there's a lot of we didn't get into it too much in this conversation, but there's a lot of ways of thinking about this stuff that helps us make sense of what's going on in the Bible, in the New Testament,
Hmm.
thinking about the sacrifice of Jesus. So yeah, a lot of good stuff here. And again, I'll just plug the class one more time. Like, if you want to check us out, please do. You can come totally for free. You're welcome. But love to just
Awesome.
kind of continue to kick around
Sweet.
atonement stuff.
So I'll
Yeah.
see you there. Uh,
All right. Sounds
all
good.
right. I hope you have a great rest of your day, Mr. Botner, and
Thanks.
thanks for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.